Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our podcast sponsor. It's the Great Courses. Most of you know I've been talking about taking great courses since the 1990s, literally taking hundreds of them. This is the teaching company and they're great courses, and now they're a sponsor of the podcast because they have a new app. It's the Great Courses Plus. So you have it on your phone. It looks like this, those of you watching this, and you just tap on the app on your phone. It opens up. If you're in the middle of a course, it pops right back up to the lecture you were listening to, right in the spot where you last stopped it. Like this particular course I'm taking now is called Liberty on Trial in America, Cases That Defined Freedom. These are literally 24 different court cases, most of them U.S. Supreme Court cases, in which people were contesting various issues having to do with mostly free speech and various forms of liberty, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom to burn the flag, and those kinds of things. Anyway, it's a great deal, and they're offering podcast listeners a special 3 months for $30. That's 3 months for $30. That's less than, it's $10 a month, less than 3 Starbucks lattes a month. But to get this, you got to log on to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That is to get this deal, to get the Great Courses Plus app. For my listeners, you log on to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. Robert Frank, thanks for coming on the podcast. Congratulations on the new book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. And I like the cover. It kind of captures the image of peers' influence, the red dots and the non-red dots, I guess.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Michael. And I love the cover. I was so delighted when they sent me the mock-up of it. You know, I looked at it for a long time and kept finding new things to like about it.
Well, you're here in Santa Barbara. It's nice to have you in studio. Most of my podcasts, as you know, are done via Skype, but you're on your book tour. So you hit UC Santa Barbara today, which was nice. And somebody asked how many books you've written, and you didn't know. I understand how that works because there's the co-authored books and edited books, right. And did those count? And academic books versus trade books. I got a few of mine back here. You know, it's like, I actually don't know. How can you not know? It's crazy. Right. But I've been following your work a long time, so I'm going to open this podcast with a very famous quote you'll, of course, know from John Maynard Keynes that made me think of your work. Quote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler a few years back." So that kind of makes me think, well, this is what you do. You're an academic scribbler who's been doing economics for 40 years. And
if I ever do have any influence, it will be when I'm long since defunct.
Right.
Since I haven't had much so far.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, your writings are not just academic, but you write for the New York Times and you appear on a lot of media shows. And so, but what I'm getting at is that you're not just an academic researcher interested in answering some question, but also policy recommendations. Given that we know X causes Y, then how can we apply that politically, economically to cause social change? So give us kind of a big picture of your career. Is this kind of been the mission since you were young? Like, I want to get out there and change the world, and economics is the way to do it?
No, not at all, Michael. I didn't have that vision. I went to Georgia Tech as an undergraduate, and the people in my social circle at that time, the ambitious young men, they wanted to be president of a company by the time they were 40, and so most of them wanted to go to Harvard Business School. They saw that as a good route. I guess I had that vision for a couple of years there, but in my junior year, I switched from engineering to major in math, and then as a senior, I was asked to teach a freshman math course. I'm sure they'd be horrified that I'm revealing that to anybody outside the community. There must have been several deaths or sudden departures that they would have even stooped to ask an undergraduate to teach a course like that. But But I think I did a good job, and I really liked it. So I decided then that teaching was a career to consider. And I went in the Peace Corps directly after graduation from Tech and spent 2 years in Nepal. It was quite common for Peace Corps volunteers to think about becoming development economists. And so I had taken an introductory economics course as an undergraduate. So I applied to graduate programs and went to Berkeley when they offered me the best fellowship that any of the various places that had let me in did. And there wasn't anybody good in development economics at Berkeley, I discovered upon arrival. And so I went into just a mainstream economics program, which turned out to be actually a much better option for me. And I've gotten interested in policy issues. I think most of them related in some way to the experience I had in Nepal. The thing I think I took from there that's been really most influential in my thinking was that Nepal, even though it was the poorest country I think we had data for at that time, it's still very poor. The human drama seemed to play out in essentially the same way there as I was used to thinking about it in this country, even though the material standard was so much different. There are things you wouldn't want to have happen to you as a result of the conditions there. I mean, you'd be much more likely to lose a kid to illness than we are. But just the feel of life day to day, the fact that I lived in a 2-room house with no electricity or plumbing, that just was not an issue. I was proud to invite people over. It wasn't
right.
And I think except for that experience, I wouldn't have thought nearly as much about consumption patterns and the like.
So development economics is how to help developing countries become developed countries, how to get the poor to become rich,
right,
sustainable, or something like that. And Nepal must have been one of the poorest in the world. They probably still are fairly.
Yeah, they're among the poorest. Yes.
So why haven't you development economists been able to change their status?
Well, we have in good measure. I'm not a development economist, as it turned out, but I don't know if you can attribute the progress that's been made to development economists. They've tried to help, but mainly I think technology and the spread of markets has made just unbelievable progress possible. I mean, China, nobody would have imagined 50 years ago that they could be where they are now. Never mind whether they would be. So yeah, I think
when we were kids, it was eat your dinner because there's people starving in China.
Yeah,
and that's changed in the last decade.
Although one of my favorite cartoons was a Chinese mother telling her toddler, "Eat your rice. Don't you know there are people in West Virginia who are starving?"
Right. Yes. Well, we have our poor here. So obviously, it's not as simple as like conservatives say. Well, you see, that's an example. If you bring free markets to a poor country, they'll become rich. That's a single variable vector, and that's probably way too simple.
It's a big part of why we're so much richer, even in the countries that were relatively rich 200 years ago. I mean, Smith's time in Scotland, that was a poor country by today's standards.
Yeah.
It's vastly richer than it used to be. And I think it's his narrative about what markets do that's the main reason for that. It was not his claim, even though many modern economists attribute it to him. It was not his claim that turn selfish people loose in the free marketplace, don't get in their way, and they will reliably produce the greatest good for the greatest number. He didn't say that. He would be kind of a whiny liberal, I think, by today's standards.
Yeah.
But what was remarkable to him was that you often got good results from that, and you have to really underline the often. It really does happen much of the time. Competition often leads to bad results too, and I think it wasn't until Darwin wrote that I think we had a good theoretical framework for thinking about why it helps in some cases and not in others.
So much involves luck. You wrote a book about luck that influenced my thinking on this. Just the luck that we were born in America, and what if we had been born in Nepal? You didn't make it. There's no like free choice. I willed my way
Most people who succeed here really do believe that they made it on their own, and I think it's natural probably to think that. You did work hard in most cases. You were good in most cases. The competition is so stiff that if you weren't both hardworking and good, you probably wouldn't have made it.
Right.
But to have started here in the first place, that's
Right.
an enormous stroke of good luck. And even among the people who started here, there are plenty who are just as smart as you, who worked just as hard, who didn't make it. So
Right.
what's the difference? There were just, maybe a mentor who helped you at one stage or another. There were lucky breaks you had along the way.
Like when Obama gave that speech, the "You Didn't Make It" speech, now famous, and conservatives' heads exploded. And at first I thought, that's not right. Of course I write my columns, I write my books. If I don't do it, no one's going to do it for me. There's no luck there. But when you bore down a little bit what he was talking about, the roads that we all drive on, the educational system that we're all given, and all the tides are lifted, the fact that we live in a society of the rule of law and a successful economic system and a stable banking system and so on, I didn't do anything to deserve that.
Right. Yeah, we're all beneficiaries of those external events.
Yeah. So, so that's called the just world theory that conservatives hold, that the world is just, so the successful are successful because they're hardworking and creative, and the poor are poor because they didn't work hard enough or something like that. But I've been thinking about this even more a little bit after reading your luck book, was that even if you wake up in the morning full of vim and vigor and you want to go out and make your mark, and you have a high need of achievement and you really want to be successful, and you measure that by making money in the business world, say, well, we know from behavior genetics that at least 50% of the variance of people's need of achievement, risk-taking, openness to experience, getting out there into the world to try things, that's at least half genetics. So to a certain extent, you didn't wake up and decide, today I'm going to be ambitious. It's like, this is just who I am. I just get up early and I go to work. Other people don't feel that way.
Why are we the way we are? We don't know exactly, but we do know that it's some mix of genes and upbringing. And if you stand back a step or two, you would quickly recognize that you're not really entitled to any moral credit for having good genes or having had a good upbringing, for that matter. That was all external to you. And so I think it would be meaningful to say that it's all luck, really, but I don't say that.
Right.
I think it's just it's a strategic reason for not saying that, because it's true, the temperament that leads you to work hard, there are real differences in people on that dimension. My wife has a much stronger dose of that than I do. I often think if I had her dose of that, I could have made something myself. But sometimes I do work hard, and it's hard to work hard. And I think if you don't feel entitled to give yourself a little credit for summoning the energy when you'd really rather do something else, and you're up against a couple of failures, and you got to just pick yourself up off the mat and find a way forward, celebrate the fact that you worked hard. I really hung in there. I did what I needed to do. Give yourself credit for that, even though in another way of looking at it, it's all luck that you were able to do that. If you didn't give yourself credit, you'd be less likely to be able to summon that energy. And so it's just adaptive that we maintain the myth that you had something to do with it.
Yeah, I think that is part of it. A story we tell ourselves.
Yes.
The people, as the line is, born on third base and say, I hit a triple.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't know why some people are successful when everybody's, say, lifted fairly high up. I've been my good fortune to meet a lot of successful academics and scientists and researchers, and a few stand out as exceptionally successful. But I know, like at the B level, the next level down, I know hundreds of them who work their asses off. They're super smart. They're at great institutions. They've done everything right, and they just can't seem to break through. And a lot of them, they really want it bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't really know why you're there and not there. I mean, it's just many are called, few are chosen. I don't know.
It's a lot of different reasons. Yeah, I think the context in which an idea appears matters enormously. Sometimes people are ready for the idea and run with it when it appears. An idea can be introduced, this very same idea, at a different time, and there's just no fertile ground for it to land on. And so, it's very external.
I use that example. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who used this. Had Bill Gates been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later.
Yes.
Now, I've met Bill. He's an incredibly smart guy, hardworking. He'd be successful in any century or decade.
Yeah.
But the world's richest man, I think there's a certain timing for that particular moment.
And to his credit, he seems keenly aware of that. He knows that if he hadn't gone to the Lakeside School in Seattle, where there were computer terminals, no other schools had that. If he hadn't been able to use the computer system as a high school student at the University of Washington, had all those hours on task, he wouldn't have had the ingredients to even compete in the digital revolution. He had them by pure good fortune, but the timing too. Yeah, he knows that. Yeah, he wouldn't have been a big deal in all likelihood if he'd been born in other circumstances.
And not only credit that and acknowledge it, but give away most of his money, which he can't seem to do fast enough.
Yes.
Again, a credit to our economy. You just invest it wisely, and he can't give it away,
right.
Which is pretty amazing. But in a way, this is, to me, an example of kind of a bottom-up, self-organized way of giving back or redistributing income, where the richest rich, say the 0.01% or whatever Gates is in, they just sort of say, this is what we're going to do, and you should do it too.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you don't want to do it, so this would be an example of your behavioral contagion. Maybe you don't really want to do it, but you'd like to be on that new Forbes 400 list of the richest people who are giving, what is it, the pledge where they give away 50% of their wealth. So there's kind of a status to giving it away now.
Right. Yeah, I had an Israeli friend who said that they publish how much tax you pay each year in Israel, or they used to, and her father had a bad business year and felt so bad about people seeing the low tax he paid. He actually paid voluntarily a much higher payment to the government that year.
Transparency.
Yeah. So
see there, I think you're tapping into your behavioral contagion is our interest in reputational management. I care. We're a social primate species. We care about what everybody else thinks about us.
We virtue signal in the modern term. It's definitely something that happens. We see it.
Yeah. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of free will and determinism, but in a way, your book taps into it when you're talking about circumstances and peer influence and all the things we've already been talking about. What about the role for volition and free will? Hey, why can't I resist the influence now that I know about it? So what is your position on that?
Yeah, I think the book started with a column I wrote in the Times, it must have been January 17, saying that we had gotten the wrong reason when we tried to explain why we began taxing cigarettes and regulating where you could smoke and banning it in restaurants, bars, and some public spaces, and so on. We said we needed to do that to prevent causing harm to hapless victims from secondhand smoke. There are studies in Japan showing that there was an effect like that. We're so resistant to regulation and taxation that we need a John Stuart Mill reason for it. The only legitimate grounds for the state to tell you can't do what you want to do is to prevent you from causing harm to others. I think he must have meant undue harm to others because you can't open your mouth without damaging some sensitive soul somewhere. So the real harm you do when you take up smoking is you make others around you more likely to take up smoking too. It's a huge effect. So if you're worried your daughter is going to smoke, you don't learn anything by knowing that she's a science fiction fan. That doesn't tell you anything.
Right.
Is she good in math? That doesn't help you to know the answer to that question. The thing that really matters is the fraction of her friends who smoke. If the percentage goes from 20 to 30, she becomes 25% more likely to either begin smoking or remain a smoker if she already is one. It's a huge effect. It's larger than any other effect. And if you take up smoking, you don't ask yourself, should I do it? I might encourage others to. Your effect on the environment is so small. But you should ask yourself that, and we can't expect people to voluntarily ask themselves that. So my claim was that that's a very good reason for the government to discourage people from smoking, because they don't take into account the harm they do to others by
just
making
their
them more
actions.
likely to smoke. And the pushback I got from that column was what led me to write the book. The objectors said, well, yeah, fine, there is harm, but it's not the government's job to protect people from making bad choices about which peers to imitate and which ones to sort of avoid imitating. That's their responsibility. They have agency. We don't intervene there.
Right.
And I'm very sympathetic to the sentiment that gives you that that objection, but there are other people whose interests are at stake too. So as a parent, I really hoped my kids wouldn't smoke.
Right.
I have 4 adult sons. None of them does smoke. The reason they don't smoke is that the environment has so few smokers in it now.
Well, you mentioned the book. You were a smoker for a while.
I started smoking at age 14.
14.
Many of my friends had been smokers already for a couple of years. My parents smoked. They didn't want me to smoke, but they smoked. So that was a kind of a hypocritical objection, it seemed to me at the time. But if you're a parent and you want your kids to grow up to be non-smokers, you really care how many people out there are smoking.
But wait, you did stop.
I did
despite
stop.
all the factors you just outlined. So is that a role for agency and volition right there?
Oh, no, I grant fully that
Yeah.
there is agency and volition. But what's also true is that if more people smoke, many parents, despite having taken every step they could reasonably imagine taking, are going to fail in their goal to raise kids to grow up to be non-smokers. We don't know who
Right.
will avoid the peer influence and who
Right.
won't. That's not knowable. Some people have agency for who knows what reasons they exercise it. But there are going to be millions of people who are going to crush the hopes of their parents by taking up smoking because more people in the environment were smoking. And that's harm. Those parents get harmed by the fact that they couldn't achieve their goal. Do we not count that in the cost-benefit test?
Yeah.
Yeah, the real harm you do when you smoke is to make others more likely to smoke.
Yeah, that's the central core of your book that's different than all the others. Parenthetically, by the way, back in the 90s, we did an article in skeptical of secondhand smoke, the claims that secondhand smoke was harmful to people. It's really hard to measure because the effects are so small. To me, it didn't matter because I'm glad that people can't smoke in restaurants anymore or airplanes. Not because I'm thinking about, am I going to get cancer or not? It stinks.
Yeah.
And it spoils the experience, like in a restaurant or in a hotel room, even if it's a non-smoking room. The older hotels, it's in the drapes, it's in the carpeting, it stinks. You can smell the moment you walk in. That diminishes the experience just as much as if my neighbor was blasting his music at volume 11 at midnight.
Right. And we would not have changed the environment as dramatically as we succeeded in doing if it had just been the taxes and the bans. You can still smoke quite easily, even if you can't smoke here or there. You can smoke somewhere not too far away. We know we can estimate pretty precisely what the price effect will be when we raise the price of the good. Demand for it will fall, true enough, but those effects are pretty small. You can't generate the kind of reduction in smoking rates that we've seen that occurred so quickly over the last couple of decades without offering something like the contagion narrative. So few people didn't start smoking because of the taxes or the inconvenience, and that meant in their circle fewer smokers were influencing other people to start smoking, and then the fact that they didn't start had ripple effects too. And once that picked up some steam, you got a huge multiplier effect, and that's the low-hanging fruit, I claim, in the public policy domain. We have a keen interest in the social environment because it affects us so strongly, and there are actually very simple things we can do to get people to behave as if they cared about how their own choices would affect the social environment. So why not at least think about that?
Well, it starts with just talking about it.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Let's say a century from now, only like 1% of people smoke, and social scientists do a study on like what caused that decline from 80%. In 1900 to 1% in 2100, say, two centuries. It could be the behavioral contagion effect, just from, say, fewer actors smoking in films and TV, or not as many commercial. Well, there's no commercials now. And so that probably is more of a driver than the thing that conservatives and libertarians don't like is this top-down draconian government
Right.
going to nanny state, going to tell you what you can and cannot do. Maybe the better argument is, bottom up is better through behavioral contagion.
Yeah, and an argument that I push in the book, although some mistake me for saying that the only remedy I favor is a tax remedy, but it is often a remedy that's far more palatable to people who care about liberty than direct regulations and prohibitions.
Oh, right.
And so if you really care a lot about smoking, if they make it more expensive for you to smoke, okay, you can say, I'm causing others by smoking. It's okay. It's fair. It's just for me to have to pay a penalty for the harm I'm causing. The fact that the government's collecting revenue from my smoking means that it can lower the taxes on other activities that are not harmful. For example, the payroll tax. Currently, we get a lot of revenue by taxing company payrolls. That makes companies less likely to hire any given worker because the cost-benefit test shifts against the worker when you tax payrolls. Why not lower that tax and replace the revenue we lose by an additional levy on an activity that causes harm to others? There's just no downside. Why wouldn't you want to approve that?
A couple other examples I had reading your book was I'm married. My partner, who does the covers for Skeptic Magazine, Pat Lindsay, she's not married, but we want to be paid equal because we're equal partners. So I have to pay. We have to pay her $1,000 a month more than me for us to be equal because I get a break for being married. So the government has apparently a tax break. Yeah. So the government has apparently decided we want people to be married. And we're going to give them a bonus here,
but we're going to make it more expensive to them.
to be, Or I'm a homeowner, so I could deduct my interest on the mortgage every year. That I love that. I hope that doesn't change. But in a way, it's the government saying we want our citizens to be homeowners. Now we can't force them, but we can give them a tax break if they do this.
Right.
So we've been doing this for forever. Anyway,
it's not controversial. I mean, some people say any tax is bad. I think those people don't really belong in the conversation. All taxation is theft, blah, blah. Yeah. If you don't tax, then you can't maintain a government or an army. I know some of those people,
anarcho-capitalists, yes.
So if you don't have an army, then you get invaded by another country that has one, and you pay tax to them. So the only interesting questions are, what should we tax and how much? And the second question is much more difficult because it gets into deep woods about the scope of government, the scale of what we want to do in the public sphere. But the first question is just not controversial. We should tax activities that cause harm to others.
So smoking, you also cover alcohol consumption, what else? Obesity, diet, soda drinks. Remember Bloomberg passed that law in New York City, and he got hammered for that.
He didn't pass it either. He tried.
It didn't pass, right.
To his credit, he favored a tax on 32-ounce sugared drinks, or maybe even by the content of sugar in them. The legislature would have prevented that from going into effect, and so in succession, he proposed a couple of other measures. One was to just ban outright the sale of 32-ounce soft drinks, and that's a very clumsy way to attack the problem. That didn't work either, but a tax on sugar, in the book I describe an imaginary conversation between myself, an advocate of taxing behavioral externalities, I call them. If I behave in a way that makes the social climate more likely to make people do things they wish they wouldn't do, that's a behavioral externality. And my claim is that it's exactly equivalent to an externality of the usual sort, like smoke, toxic fumes, noise, congestion. All the people who think about those problems agree without argument that taxation is by far a better way to limit those problems than direct regulation and prescriptive steps that we've tried as alternatives. And so Why not?
And your argument is not just that because in the long run, the rest of us are going to have to cover their health care bills when they're older and so on. Because if they died early, then we wouldn't have to cover their health care bills.
In fact, in the smoking arena, that was the number two rationale. When it became clear that secondhand smoke wasn't that big of a problem, certainly not big enough to justify the high taxes and intense regulations, then we said, we heard it said, that the people who smoke get sick in ways that others don't, so they require the government to step in and pay for health care for them. And that sounded pretty reasonable. But then an economist studied that claim and found that smokers, number one, die earlier than non-smokers. They don't collect nearly as much in pension payments. When they die of illnesses that kill them pretty quickly. If you have lung cancer, that's not a lingering illness, or at least it didn't used to be. And so you don't run up chronic care under the Medicaid budget. If you're a smoker, you're actually a plus on the government budget. So the only real rationale that survives the intense measures we've taken to inhibit smoking are the claims about how what you do in that domain affects others.
Yeah. And I think it was Nicholas Christakis, who I had on the podcast, who did the research on obesity.
Yes.
And your chances of being obese go way up the moment you hang around obese people.
Yeah.
It's just so weird because it's like, but I eat whatever I eat. Well, you don't. It's a social thing.
His study with Fowler was one of the landmarks in this attempt to convey what the actual magnitude of these contagion effects are. And it was striking how strong they were. There was a separate study, which was from a methodological perspective, much more solid in establishing the causal link. And it was that when the military would send a family to a new location, if the county had an obesity rate that was 1% higher than where they'd been, the adults in the family became 5% more likely to become obese in the new location. It's a huge effect.
Amazing. So let's talk about some of the more positive spins on this. I was thinking about moral progress, which I've written about when I was reading your book, like how certain movements take off. You write about the gay rights movement. I think you quoted Andrew Sullivan, who I've been reading for a long time, who back in the 90s was basically saying, okay, it's time. How are we going to do this? And it wasn't really top-down laws that were passed. It was all the bottom-up stuff. Ellen coming out on television.
Yes.
The scripts of movies and television shows, comic books, novels, all of us having our consciousness raised, just who knows how, just language, the words that we use.
Yeah, it was a classic example of behavioral contagion. I mean, in many countries still, you can be executed for being same-sex.
Right.
And it's never been that bad here, but it was once pretty taboo to advocate allowing people to marry whomever they chose. And there were plenty of people who probably believe, why shouldn't we allow them to do that? But they were not bold enough to say that publicly because they would be cordoned off into is this person playing with a full deck kind of category. But as more and more people came out, as more and more people realized they had a kid or a nephew who was gay, it just got easier and easier for people to express whatever opinion they were holding silent. And as more people spoke out, that made everyone who spoke out made it easier for the next one to speak out. And,
that's a big.
And wow, was it fast once it started.
So what do you call it? You call it positive behavioral externality.
A behavioral externality.
Positive behavior.
That's a positive behavioral externality, and it's a domino effect. Really, it can be explosively fast.
I wrote about this in Moral Arc in my chapter on gay rights, reading Jonathan Rauch, who's a longtime defender of liberty and free speech, especially. He's a gay guy. And so he's been writing about this a long time. He says, I'm writing here, gay's most urgent need was epistemological, not political. We had to replace bad ideas with good ones. Mm-hmm. That replacement can only happen in a free society in which open debate is allowed and ideas must compete for cognitive space in our brains. As it is now unfolding for gay rights, so it is for all human rights. As Rauch explains, history shows that the more open the intellectual environment, the better minorities do. We learn empirically that women are as intelligent and capable as men. This knowledge strengthens the moral claims of gender equality. We learn from social experience that laws permitting religious pluralism make societies more governable. This knowledge strengthens the moral claims of religious liberty. We learn from critical argument that the notion that some races are fit to be enslaved and others is impossible to defend without recourse to hypocrisy and mendacity. This knowledge strengthens the moral claims of inherent human dignity. Now that comes from just the world of ideas, just books, conversations like this.
How could a person alive today not endorse that thinking 100%?
Oh, this is actually, I love that quote, but this is the better one I meant to read from his book, Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America. I think this was like in the 1995 or so, 20 years before the Supreme Court decision. He was recalling comments of a caller to a radio talk show he was on, during a book tour for his 2004 book. Yeah. Your guest, he said, meaning me, this is the caller, is the most dangerous man in America. Why? Because, said the caller, he sounds so reasonable. In hindsight, this may be the greatest compliment I've ever been paid. It is certainly among the most sincere. Despite the caller's best efforts to shut out what I was saying, the debate he was hearing and the contrast between me and my adversary was working on him. I doubt he changed his mind that day, but I could tell he was thinking, almost against his will. Hannah Arendt once wrote, "Truth carries within itself an element of coercion." The caller felt that he was in some sense being forced to see merit in what I was saying.
That's marvelous.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of how it happens. And you have a whole section on the Me Too movement. In a way, it's amazing it took that long for this shift to happen. I mean, you're a decade older than me, but you've been a college professor. I remember, I think it was about the early 90s when we all started being, sort of encouraged, don't sleep with the students. We know this has been going on for decades. This has to stop. No more of this. And then in the 2000s, I remember we all took the computer training programs. Like, here's all the scenarios. Do not do this. Do not do this. Right. It's like it's been pounding in us from the top down. And then the Me Too movement happened. It's like, these guys are like my age. What were they thinking?
Yeah, the Me Too movement started at a very specific moment in 2017. It was a hashtag in a tweet. There didn't used to be hashtags in tweets.
Right.
In fact, there was an attempt, a perfectly legitimate attempt, to start the Me Too movement. It was even called that 10 years earlier, and it gained no traction whatsoever. So I think the technology now enables change to happen much, much more rapidly than it ever would have if there's a case for it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we see change happen when there's a specious case for change. So it's not like automatically everything's going to get better now. You got to work to get the good argument to triumph over the bad one. But I think in the long run, there is a tendency for good arguments to beat bad ones. I mean, the current environment really makes you question whether that is such a solid thing to bank on. But I think...
What do you mean?
Well, we see a lot of bad arguments with half-lives longer than I would have expected.
Right. Yeah, right. Well, and it's so unpredictable. I mean, why that moment for the Me Too movement instead of 10 years early? I don't think it's just technological, like it's available on Twitter. I've been thinking about this. When did 9/11 become the phrase we use for that day? Mm-hmm. Not like anybody said, okay, we're going to call what happened 9/11. Mm-hmm. But it just started, and I've never read anything where anybody tracked it down. It was like right there, somebody wrote that in the New York Times or whatever. And Dawkins calls these memes, right? Why did they take off? I don't know. Back in the 90s, somebody tried to introduce the word bright instead of atheist. The idea of the word atheist, still, it's kind of pejorative, but it was even worse in the 90s. And they said, okay, we need to take our cues from the gay rights movement. You're gay, it's happy, you're positive. Uh-huh. And so atheism is kind of dark and down and immoral and you're un-American. How about we call ourselves the Brights? This was this couple that introduced us. Dan Dennett wrote a op-ed in the New York Times saying, let's call ourselves the Bright. Come on, everybody, let's try it. Because people will go, what the hell is a Bright? And then that's your opening to go, oh, I'll tell you what it is. I don't believe in God and supernatural and so on. Never took off.
Which is why I had no idea what you were talking about.
You never heard of it. Yeah, because the obvious antonym is, so people that don't believe in God are what? Dim? The lights, the brights, and the dims. And of course, a lot of atheists go, yeah. It's like, yeah, but that's not going to win us
that's not the
fans.
way forward.
No. I mean, that has always been a debate in the atheist humanist circles is,
right.
Do we go the approach of like we attack religion, debunk the supernatural, just destroy these bad ideas, and then these people will come around? Or do you take a more positive approach, like we're promoting science and reason, and hopefully people will be pulled up to that?
And in the polarized era, which we're now firmly in by every measure, it's harder and harder to get a productive conversation of an exchange of ideas going with somebody who's in the other camp. There's just extreme resistance to any utterance from the other side. And
now, are you sure it's worse than, say, during Nixon's administration? Are we having a recency effect, or is it measurably worse?
You know, I'm probably not the ultimate source on that, but my very strong belief is that it's worse now, and you know, the election forecasters are placing big bets on the fact that polarization is more intense now and predicting who's going to win which race, and they've been coming up golden on their predictions with those models. So I think we have some evidence that it is worse, and I devoted the last chapter in my book to the question of how you can get a conversation going productively with somebody who originally doesn't agree with you, and it turns out that trying to explain something that they don't already believe is just it's not only not effective, it's counterproductive. The far better advice is just to talk about something neutral and listen, and then see where the conversation goes. You might find an opportunity to have an exchange that matters. But the research on this question has one very clear finding, which is that if you can ask the right question, that seems to open people up to thinking in a fresh way about things. So I've experienced this myself in a very vivid way in conversations about the Affordable Care Act. The people who were against it liked some of its features. They liked the fact that the insurance companies couldn't turn you down if you had a pre-existing condition. They wanted to keep that. What they really hated, almost every opponent, was the fact that the government made you buy insurance. They're robbing my freedom by doing that. And you could try to explain the logic of insurance markets, how the economics of a private market for insurance would unfold. If you didn't have, you would get nowhere with that attempt. I just asked somebody in one of those conversations, what do you think would happen if the government required home insurers to sell fire insurance to people at reasonable rates, mind you, to people whose homes had already burned down? And that's not a threatening question. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Well, let me think about it. And people would not need to think about that for more than a moment to say, well, that'd be nuts. The insurance companies would go bankrupt in short order, because why would anybody buy health insurance until his house had already burned down, if you could do that? And so then it's a very short step for people to recognize that the guy with pre-existing conditions, that's the exact case of the patient. The patient who has those, he's the guy whose house is already burned down. You can't insure that guy unless you give everybody else in the pool. And you can't get them all in the pool without something either like the mandate they had or something roughly equivalent to that.
Yeah, there you're getting at framing issues of how an issue is framed in somebody's mind, depending on their, say, political values. Steve Pinker makes the point that one of the worst things that happened for the climate movement, environmental movement, was Al Gore's film, which was, huge at the time, but then that made global warming affiliated with liberalism, the Democratic Party, the left, the far left, the progressives, the regressive left. They want to take away our freedom and destroy us and turn us into communists. Wait, I thought we were talking about CO2 gases. How did we get into communism?
And every time Al Gore would make a public statement about a new study that showed that the problem was more serious than we thought, the people on the other side would just harden their views that it was a less important problem. So,
that's the so-called backfire effect. so-called backfire effect. But the guys researching the backfire effect are finding that there are ways to work around it, where particularly visual data seems to influence people's ideas more. They can accept if it's a nice graph, you can see something going up, something like that helps. And also taking off the table the particular moral foundational beliefs that they hold that they're never going to give up. I always made this point about with creationists, evolution, people that debated creationists. If you give somebody a choice between Darwin and Jesus, Darwin's going to lose every time. So you got to take the Jesus thing off the table and just say, look, maybe this is the way God made the diversity of life through natural selection. Oh, okay. Then you're just talking about natural selection and not religion.
Right.
And same thing, I think, with your faith. You spent a lot of time toward the end of your book on climate. I think you just have to take off the table this whole business of free market economics and capitalism and so on, because people don't want to give that up. Some people.
This has been an issue for me for 40 years, really, in my own writings. People used to ask me, well, where are you politically? And my answer would always be, I'm a radical pragmatist. Almost all the policies I recommend are what economists call Pareto improving. They make the pie bigger. And when the pie gets bigger, it's metaphorically and in real life always possible to cut it up in a way that everybody gets a bigger slice than before. Mm-hmm. So it's all we're doing things wrong. We're inefficient. If we would eliminate that, the pie would get bigger. We could split things up so that we'd all have more than we used to have. That's not a left-right thing. Everybody ought to be in favor of that. And yet many of the policies I propose have been associated with the left, and so I've been branded as left. But it's not left or right. It's radical pragmatism. Radical only because nobody else has been pushing this to the same degree. But it's not left or right.
Interesting. You avoid the label, so you would not call yourself a liberal or classical liberal.
Oh, I vote left because the people on the left are more likely to support policies I think are right for reasons other than the ones they offer.
Separating social liberalism from economic liberalism, I think we're on the same page with social liberalism. I think there's some debate about economic, to what extent do we grow government versus keeping it small in the economy. So there it seems to be a division amongst liberals.
Yeah, all right. But if we focus on the big issues, the climate is the threat that's going to bury all of us if we're not quick to act.
Maybe. I'm not 100% on board with the predictions of by 2100 doomsday and so on.
Well, all right. So,
but we should do something.
But Santa Barbara is been affected more than any other spot on Earth, apparently, by
the fires. Yes, no, there's no question. There's global warming is real, human cause. It's having some effects for sure. So we should do something.
And there are positive feedback loops that are maybe about to be triggered or might eventually be triggered that would have dramatically worse effects. The least favorable outlook I've seen in scouring the literature recently is a recent study showing that CO2 levels beyond a certain point would result or could result in there being zero cloud cover anywhere on the Earth. And if that happened, the temperature increase would be 14 degrees centigrade, that above whatever other cause was at work. So it could be an existential threat. It could be just a serious threat, but nobody reasonable who's read the current evidence thinks we don't need to do anything about it. And it's pretty clear that to really do something about it will be very expensive.
Yeah.
And my claim is that we could raise all the money we need to do to adopt the changes that would make a difference without requiring wealthy people who would have to be, in the end, the source of that money to make any painful sacrifices at all. And that's, I think, neither a left claim or a right claim. It's a pragmatic claim.
Yeah.
It's a claim that follows just logically from very simple premises that no behavioral scientist would question.
So in shifting toward climate solutions, what would be the equivalent of the behavioral contagion of smoking or obesity in the climate debate. It's how much CO2 gas I personally or my country produces that contributes to the overall problem. So we want to reduce that by changing people's behaviors. Is that what you're arguing?
The economists and many climatologists have long said that changing people's individual behaviors voluntarily is a kind of a fool's errand.
Right.
What we need is massive public investment in decarbonization. The engineers can tell us what it would take. It would take trillions of dollars a year for a not a trivial period, but we have spent money on that scale in real terms during World War II, for example. We mobilized.
Yep.
We got through that. The personal behaviors. I think the economists, and I was in this group with them in terms of this view. So if you buy a Prius, you have a Tesla. You're doing your part. But whether you do that or you don't do that, the world's going to be exactly the same as before. If everybody did it, that would be good. But you're doing it. Isn't everybody doing it?
Right.
If everybody did it and you didn't do it, well, then it would be good. But it wouldn't matter that you didn't do it.
Right.
The individual behaviors, I now believe, really do matter. And they matter for two reasons. One is that we know that if you do it, others will be more likely to do it. I don't think that link was ever factored into any of the conversation.
Right.
So the Prius came out. It was an odd shape. People knew you had a hybrid car if you were driving it. That car sold like hotcakes. The Honda Civic, which looked the same as the hybrid version or the non-hybrid, you couldn't tell them apart. The hybrid version didn't sell. Nobody knew you had it, and so nobody was influenced to buy one if you had one. The individual steps you take, eating meat a little less often, biking to work rather than driving, those effects not only limit what you emit, other people see you do them. They maybe think about doing them for the first time. Maybe they talk to you about it. Maybe it just becomes the thing to do. So you have a very broad shadow that you cast when you do even seemingly trivial effects like that. And the data are just compelling in the case of sunroof.
Solar panels. Yeah.
Solar panels. The Google Project Sunroof, it's called. They'll show you an aerial photo of your neighborhood. The houses that have solar panels on them have red dots. They're marked, and the ones that have them are almost always next to a house that has one.
Right.
The ones that don't have them, they're all in clusters where none of the neighboring houses have them.
So that would be
either.
the sort of thing where government gives you a tax break if you have solar panels.
Yeah, that starts
nudges.
the project, the process going, and then it acquires a momentum that's way bigger than any of the estimates of the direct effects would ever imagine could happen.
And what do you say to countries like China that says, look, we're just getting out of poverty. We're going to keep burning fossil fuels because it's the cheapest, most efficient way to do it. A little closer on the microphone. Yeah. I mean, so our poor countries that go, we want to be rich. You guys went through 2 centuries of industrial revolution with burning fossil fuels. It's our turn.
Yeah, we can bring others on board. It's about to be true because of what we've done so far that generating power from wind and solar will soon, in many places, be much cheaper than actually using existing fossil fuel plants to generate that same power. Once that's true, you don't need anybody to have any special incentives other than just the fact that, hey, we got 2 ways we could do this. One's cheaper. Why not do it that way since it's also cleaner?
Yeah. What about nuclear?
The engineer whose opinion I most value says he's not going to weigh in on nuclear. He says that it's very complicated to get support for building nuclear. It's expensive to do it, and that the savings that you get from any reasonable estimate of what you'd be able to do is so small that you're much better off concentrating that same energy building solar and wind.
I like on this Stuart Brand, Mr. Whole Earth Catalog guy. He's a big environmentalist, right? Totally pro-nuclear. Got to go nuclear.
Oh, yeah.
Although he does make the point, paste what you just said, it's overly regulated. We have to allow experimentation with these small, nuclear units, really just the size of this room, and try different experiments. The problem is we have zero tolerance for failure.
Right.
So you're going to have a huge regulation.
And so I think, Saul Griffiths is the engineering authority on all the possibilities, and he outlines a pretty credible process of mobilization whereby we could actually get to where we need to get to with solar and wind primarily.
Yeah.
And
I don't know, I read that and I go, yeah, okay, that's great. And then I'll read somebody else, maybe they're conservative, I don't know what, but they go, you could have the entire planet covered in solar panels and it wouldn't be the equivalent of what we're burning in fossil fuels for energy.
I think don't read that source anymore. That's just way far from actually correct.
Well, I'm all in favor of. I love solar. We have deserts out there in California here that are just just open to this. If that would really do it.
There was a map I saw recently published that showed the area you'd have to devote to solar in the U.S. to generate the total amount of power we use. And it's the same as the area that we now devote to golf courses in the U.S.
Okay.
So if you look at it on the national map, it's like the area of a New England, a small New England state.
Yeah,
nothing.
Yeah. And what about economists like Ted? I think it's Ted Nordhaus who writes about
Bill
this.
Nordhaus.
Bill Nordhaus, and then Bjorn Lomborg, who's not an economist but more of a statistician. But his arguments. And so their argument is you could spend $1 trillion a year or whatever, and by 2100 we'll reduce the temperature by 0.5 degree or 1 degree or something. Whereas if we spent the money, so it depends what the goal. If we spend the money on mosquito nets and potable water and food for poor countries, and so you'd save way more lives than we'd lose if it got, say, 3 degrees warmer. These kind of cost benefit analyses.
Yeah, we're going to be doing plenty of mitigation too. The technologies that we would deploy are for the most part clean. There are, if you think about the existing industries that we rely on for power, the number of jobs that we're losing in coal and other fossil fuels each year are swamped by the number of new jobs that we're seeing in installing solar panels, building wind turbines. So it's not like we would become poorer if we made these investments. The attraction of the tax scheme I propose is to transfer money that would be spent on very high-end consumption otherwise. And if there's any one conclusion, there's a huge and very contentious, actually, literature on the determinants of human well-being. And the one most rock-solid finding in it is that beyond a certain point, if the houses get bigger for everyone, nobody gets any happier.
Right.
If you spend more on weddings beyond some point, nobody gets any happier.
But that assumes that the happiness is the measure we want. Why should it be happiness?
You'd rather be happy than unhappy, and
but I could tolerate less happiness, but more meaningful, purposeful.
Yes, of course. You'd want to be happier rather than less happy if you could do that without giving anything else up that you care about.
Yeah.
And if you could enact a policy that would prevent people at the top from going from 10,000 square feet to 15,000 square feet. Actually, if they went from 10,000 to 15,000 square feet, not only would they not get happier, they'd get less happy. It's just so much more bother to.
I don't want a house that big. I have a 2,600 square foot house.
There you
my
go.
wife and my son, and that is plenty. I don't want more. So these studies that you cite, like people would rather have a 5,000 square foot, and so on. I don't want a 5,000 square foot house.
But you don't want a house that's cheaper than everyone else has, because then your kid would go to a bad public school.
There's the neighborhood thing, but I was thinking about this reading your book. When I moved to Santa Barbara 4 years ago, we bought a house that some investors had tore down and built a new house. So I now have the nicest house on my block.
Okay.
I don't want the nicest house on my block, because the moment I bought it, just for fun, like 3 months later, I looked up on one of those real estate things and it dropped at like $200,000 in value. The moment I bought it, it's like, oh, I see, because all the other houses on average are lower. because they make those estimates of the
Right.
value of your house based on houses that are sold
Right.
in the neighborhood. And I thought, oh, I see. I want like a middle or maybe lower, and all the big mansions pull me up.
Anyway, the wealthy, the people who have we would not raise money for decarbonizing the economy by taxing the poor.
Yeah, that's
or
right. Yeah,
the middle
right.
income earners.
It's the what 1% or the 0.01%.
Willie Sutton,
Yeah.
Rob Banks, because
Right.
that's where the money is. If
Right.
you want money to decarbonize, that's
Right.
where you have to go. And those people, I don't think they would tell you they're worried about somebody enacting a tax bill that would threaten their ability to buy what they need. I mean, that's just not on the table.
Right.
What are you worried about then? Well, life's not just about what you need. It's about what you want. There are extras in life that you want, I want, we all want. They're scarce. That's what it means to be special, is to be, it's a relative concept. And how do you get the things that there aren't enough of? Well, of course, you have to bid for them in our system. That's favors don't much matter in our system that way. So you bid for them. If your taxes go up and my taxes go up, and we each want the same penthouse apartment, that apartment's going to go to the same high bidder as before.
Right.
It's relative bidding power that matters for that, and that's completely unaffected by how high the top tax rate is. So it's in a way free money. We could take a much bigger bite out of those flows, to divert that money to building the infrastructure to generate emission-free energy for everybody. The poor people can't install the stuff on their own. We're going to have to figure out a way to pay for that.
This is what you call the mother of all cognitive illusions, right?
Yeah, the rich think it would hurt them if we tax them.
But even if the rich didn't, you have people like Warren Buffett that goes, I don't mind paying more taxes. I should.
Yeah.
And but it's like the average guy who's a Republican or conservative who's never going to be Warren Buffett, who's never going to be affected by those, still says, I'm against it because, see, here I think you're analyzing this from a utilitarian perspective. Greatest happiness, the greatest number, greatest good for the greatest number. So we have this collective action. Let's look at the most effective policy or whatever. The average guy who's, say, a conservative is coming at it from a rights perspective. I don't care what the effects are. It's my right to keep my property that I earned. I don't care if I make $10,000 a year and Buffett makes $10 million a year. It's the same principle.
Well, we think rights are important, and they are for sure. But then you have to have a conversation about which rights should we enshrine. Rights cost money to enforce. Enforcing them has consequences. Some of them quite costly.
Police, criminal justice system.
So, in the example we talked about earlier, do I have a right to smoke in light of the fact that my smoking will harm others by making them or their children more likely to become smokers? Well, that's just an empirical question in the end. If I'm causing more harm to others than the benefit I get from the right to smoke unfettered, then you could not put together a voluntary society in which people would vote to enforce that right. That would be a right that wouldn't pass the electoral test.
Do you think there are natural rights, just as a sidebar here, or we just invent them and we defend them? And if we didn't defend them, we wouldn't have those rights.
I think we resist using cost-benefit tests that we think there are just certain basic things that we need to do no matter what the costs and benefits are. So if somebody said, well, if we execute an innocent man in the public square, that'll reduce crime by enough to save way more than the value of a life, we would say, no, we don't think that's an adequate defense of the proposal to execute.
So you're against the death penalty even if it could be proved statistically that it reduces crime? I don't think it can be, but let's say that data came in. See, I'd still be against it.
We were talking here about executing an innocent man. I hope everybody's
against that. Yeah, I mean just capital
against that in principle.
I'm doing
at
a
least.
slight pivot here just to get, because you're an interesting thinker, how you think about these things. Capital punishment. Somebody just submitted an article, a skeptic, that I didn't accept because it wasn't well argued or written. But the argument was that I can show, and he just has basic correlational statistics. As death penalty goes up, and actual executions go up, crime rates go down. Well, he was doing this in the 90s when it was plummeting after 93 for other reasons. Anyway, but let's say that turned out to be true. Like, okay, I have the data that shows capital punishment. I'd still be against it because I don't want the state to have that much power to execute people, and particularly because of the Innocence Project data showing some percentage, probably 10 to 20% are innocent people being executed.
And so we were talking earlier about the strategic importance of asking the right question.
Yeah.
And so when I'm in a conversation with a pro-capital punishment advocate, I ask finally in the discussion, how many innocent people would you be prepared to execute in order to execute the guilty? And nobody wants to give you a number, 1%, half of 1%, because given that prosecutors have their own incentives, they want convictions, they want to be tough on crime, and given the imperfections of legal representation that are bound to characterize a lot of the cases, we know innocent people are going to get executed. So if you ask somebody who wants to execute people, how many do you think would be the right number to tolerate in order to be able to continue executing people? They won't go there. And I think the fact that they realize they can't go there, they can't answer that question, gives at least some of them pause when they try to defend their position going forward.
The argument I make with conservatives, like, you're against big government, right? Yeah, I hate big government. I don't want that government coming in and doing things to me. It's like, but you want them to execute people? Well, that's different because these are bad people. What about the ones that are innocent?
Yeah.
Same problem. And so here again, I think there's a lot of this in your book also in these issues of conflicting rights or between rights and utilitarian type moral arguments. So like on abortion, I'm mostly a utilitarian because the rights of the mother and the rights of the fetus to me are just, they sort of cancel out. Like I can see arguments for both. But on a utilitarian perspective, if women do not have that freedom, bad things happen.
Yeah, we know the outcomes are going to be worse on almost every dimension. Yeah. The way I
when I argue with conservatives, give me one second, one more point.
Yeah.
You and I both want to reduce the amount of abortions, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is not abortions. The problem is unwanted pregnancy.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Why are women getting, lack of education, lack of birth control, lack of economic empowerment. So we can both solve the problem with empowering women, educating women, and birth control. And they usually pivot to, but the rights of the fetus. It's like, I agree with you on the fetus, but we want to reduce the problem. So we end up, I'm talking utilitarian and they're talking rights. It's like we're just talking past each other.
Yeah, it's a very difficult issue to make progress on. The way I once thought of the issue. So the question is the mother who's pregnant finds herself in a situation where to continue with the pregnancy is going to make life very difficult. Maybe there's a fetal abnormality. Maybe it's economic or social circumstances. There's a whole panoply of possible reasons for that. And I think about, I've always been heavily influenced in my own thinking by the Darwinian perspective. So we've got genes in a body that are trying to make their way into the next round. That's usually through an offspring that is then raised and goes on to have offspring of its own. So you have the genes in a mother, the genes in the father, all these genes inside those two bodies, if they could caucus and say, what would be the best path forward to ensure that as many of us as possible made it into the next round, what would we do in this case?
Yeah.
And if it's a severely damaged fetus, I think it's clear if they were at least selfish in the narrow sense, they would say, well, the resources that are going to have to be devoted to the upbringing of this very severely disabled fetus are going to prevent many of us from having a chance at that competition to get into the next round, and so there's a lot of very subtle interests in play here, and so it's not as simple as this one has a right and those ones don't.
Yeah, Bob Trivers has his theory, of parent-offspring conflict.
Yes.
And to the parent, to the offspring, they're the most important and deserve 100% of the parent's resources. But the first sibling that comes along, okay, now there's competition for the resources. The parent has a different interest than the offspring, so you get these conflicts.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, like in Pinker's book, The Better Angel of Our Nature, he has a nice chapter on children's rights and so on. So he gets into infanticide. I knew next to nothing about infanticide, but the rates of infanticide before the 20th century were just staggering.
Yeah.
Because effective birth control was not available, effective abortion was not available.
Right.
So really, it just happened right after birth instead of in the first trimester or whatever. So it's going to happen anyway, but not out of hardness of heart. There was Steve quoted a famous paper called like hardness of life, not hardness of heart.
Yeah.
And that these mothers, sometimes parents, usually just single moms, make a triage decision. I got 3 kids already.
I can't
If I bring a 4th one, they're all doomed. I'm doomed. We're fucked. So got to do it.
Right.
Not because conservatives have this, liberals like to kill babies. What the heck are you talking about? This is so bad. I don't know if you know the work of George Lakoff, the cognitive. Yeah. So Moral Politics, one of my favorite books, explains so much because conservatives, small government. I want no next to no government except the military. Need a big military. That's expensive. What about police? Oh, we got to have a lot of police. What about courts and jails? And boom, boom, boom. And pretty soon they're growing the budget as much as any liberal administration. Right. So they're not in favor of small government. They're in favor of something else. So he calls it the strict father metaphor of the family. Yeah,
this is John Haidt's message in another way.
Yeah, that's right. It's a moral it's kind of a moral foundations theory, although there's different ways to come at it, but I like Lakoff's the strict father family metaphor of the nation.
Right.
So really, like guns, guns represent a strong father to protect the family. You know, but I thought you were in favor of big government with the police. Yeah, but they can't get there in time, so I got it. They have arguments, but it really comes down to this. When you say I'm in favor of small government, actually you're not. Right. And when I say this to conservatives, I did this on Twitter recently, I just got hammered. It's like, I am too. Don't you tell me what I believe. It's like, yeah, but you want big government, you want big military, big police, big jails. Yes, but those are necessary.
Right. Yeah, we're flexible, aren't we? If we have a point of view, we'll figure out how to defend it.
We had that exchange in the Journal of Bioeconomics, I think it was. So a couple of points I made that these will be softball questions for you to just knock out. But I had asked Jared Diamond about the peacocks and bull elk that you used in your previous book, Darwin Economy, and you make the point that what's the point of having this huge peacock tail or the giant rack of antlers? That it's better for the species if they didn't put so much resources in that. So, Jared says whether something is good or bad for peacocks and bull elk has nothing to do with what's good or bad for other species, including humans. Analogy is a dangerous guidance. Regardless of whether the peacock's tail is good or bad for the peacock species, the merits of government regulation have to be assessed without reference to peacocks.
Oh, that's an odd sentiment. It strikes me. There's a broad class of problems. I think Tom Schelling was the economist who wrote most illuminatingly about them, and they're all more or less of the structure. All stand to see better. Nobody sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated. And the peacock's tail, the antlers on the bull elk, the body mass of the bull elephant seal, those are all exactly of that structure.
Right.
It's good if the individual does it because he gets an advantage over the direct rival. The rival, of course, it's the military arms race metaphor, and there's nothing controversial about it. The people who see nations signing agreements, enforceable, inspectable agreements not to build more arms, don't say, why did they do that? I can't understand why a country would. Of course you understand why they, and to say that agreement is illegitimate because it robs countries of the freedom to decide for themselves how many armaments to stockpile. just misses the point entirely. That's
Yeah.
the whole point. Of course it does that. That's the whole point of the
Right.
agreement.
Yeah, game theorists call this an escalation game, or I think Hobbes called it, the theorists call it the Hobbesian trap, or the other guy problem.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do this, but that other guy might do it.
But to say the peacock's not relevant for thinking about government, that's kind of silly, because you're not saying that because peacocks have long tails, we need government to do X.
Well,
we're saying
so it's a metaphor.
There are many problems that have this structure, and if you don't see the essential forces as being equivalent here, and there, then you're just not seeing the structure that is the deep source of the problem.
You probably have a good answer to my friend Jennifer Diemeyer, who's an economist, but she's a big free market economist. So here's her response to your arguments. The people who jump on that hedonic treadmill and work so that they can have a yacht that's 1 foot longer than their neighbors produce massive positive external benefits to the rest of us. In order to make money, they must use available resources in a way that creates more value than anyone else with lower costs. In fact, most profit is made from reducing the transaction costs associated with getting products to consumers, which means lower prices. When some guy willingly works 80 hours a week managing a distribution system of a moderately sized corporation, everyone else benefits from that hard and probably dull work in the form of lower prices and increasing quality of goods and services. So eliminating the yacht incentive to reduce transactions costs will just increase transaction costs, making us all poor, not just the peacocks. So you probably have a quick answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, people want to succeed. That's if you look at what happens when you make boxers wear big padded gloves. They don't stop trying to hurt one another. They try
Right.
just as hard to hurt one another as before, but they don't cause quite the same degree of damage to one another as when they weren't wearing gloves. I mean, we have had this conversation about bike helmets.
Yeah,
Maybe there's some empirical reason to question whether they help, but one did save one of my son's lives once.
Yeah.
So I'm.
There's 100%. The helmets are great. You got to have helmets.
So the fact that we restrain ourselves in our competitions doesn't mean we don't get the benefit of the competition. It's still there. There were surveys done of associates in law firms. Would you want to have a 10% pay cut if that meant you could work 10% fewer hours? 90% of the associates said, yeah, they would love to have that. Why don't they do it? Because nobody would be willing to propose that unilaterally to the firm. That would be to brand himself as a slacker. If everybody did it, that'd be one thing. But everybody has to act more or less in unison to do that. And that's exactly what we do when we make it a penalty for the firm to hire you to work more than 40 hours a week. You have to pay a premium. That doesn't mean it's in a way like a tax. We're not telling you if you're in a crunch, you need to get the order filled. You can have people work overtime, but you have to pay 50% premium to do that. And that was reasonably effective in getting the work week down to 40 hours. It used to be 80 hours. And for people who aren't under the Fair Labor Standards Act, people who are fighting their way to the top, they are, like your correspondent told you, working 80 hours a week. But is that a good thing? I think they'd be a lot happier, many of them, if they weren't working 80 hours a week, if others like them weren't also working.
Yeah, maybe. Although they'd probably go, I like it. This is what I do.
Yeah.
Something like
that.
Yeah,
could be.
I don't know. I mean, just so many good examples of these behavioral contagion things where, like in the case of cycling helmets, this is all bottom up, where if you want to participate in a club ride, you got to have a helmet. It's right there in the thing you sign. Any bike races, got to have a helmet. And now, like this morning, we rode out with the guys, everyone wears a helmet. It's not required, but it would be weird to show up without a helmet. I mean, and no one would kick you out. They just like, dude, where's your helmet?
And I think sometimes we see spillover from that arena to other arenas. So I'm a skier, and nobody wore helmets skiing when I was much younger. Now I go skiing, and it's rare to see somebody not wearing a helmet.
I went skiing last weekend for the first time in 20 years. and everyone but me had a helmet on. I'm like, what the hell? And I posted a little on Twitter, a little picture of me skiing. There's like, Shermer, where's your helmet? You're always talking about helmets. I'm like, helmets and skiing? This
Why
is a
didn't
thing?
I think of that?
Yeah, and I guess so, particularly the snowboarders, because I guess they're a little high risk takers, and they do more flips and stuff where you can hit your head.
Right.
But I guess I got to get a helmet if I'm going to ski.
You need a helmet.
But that would be, again, bottom up instead of the government telling me what I have to do. Why doesn't that work for motorcyclists? Why do we have to have laws for motorcycles to wear helmets?
I had a motorcycle when I was young, and I had a lot of hair then, and I thought that was
great.
one of the nice things about going fast on a motorcycle was feeling the wind in your hair. If you wear a helmet voluntarily in some segments, you're a wimp, you're a wuss, and if a certain fraction of the people in that arena were wearing helmets, then you'd have a choice. You could or you couldn't, and nobody would think it branded you one way or another. But if it's 1%, it wouldn't happen.
Right.
It might need to be 20 or 30. I don't know. So my proposal in that domain is that we should sell permits to ride without a helmet. You get a decal from the state.
Put it on your
your motorcycle. If the cop sees the decal, you don't have a helmet, he lets you go by. If you're not wearing a helmet, then you get pulled over if you don't have the decal, and that would raise some money. We could lower the payroll tax. That would mean that the people who, like I would have been, I'm no chump. I'm not going to pay a fee just to go without a helmet. I'll wear the damn helmet. So there would be enough of us wearing helmets that it would be socially okay not to wear a helmet. That's just so much better than saying it's got to be a right one way or the other.
Yeah, I think of this like in terms of the reframing problems so that our moral values don't interfere with doing the right thing is this libertarian paternalism idea of Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who you quote a lot. You know these guys. And, I like this idea because you could say to libertarians, conservatives, look, you still have a choice.
Yeah.
And Cass makes this point, like, the choice is going to happen one way or the other. I mean, you're not living in Iceland by yourself. We're in a society, choices are made. Like in California, on my driver's license, I had to put the little tag on that I'm an organ donor.
Mm-hmm.
But in Oregon, I think it's Oregon.
It's by default.
It's by default, right? You are giving your organs unless you opt out. And so the state has to make a decision one way or the other. We're going to do this or that. Why not do the one that generates what we all recognize as an obvious
and make
value.
the default easy, even if it's just going on a website and clicking one button.
Right.
If it's the default, 98% of the people are going to do whatever the default is.
Yeah. And again, in these conflicts between utilitarianism and rights, so certain issues like organ donations, why can't I sell one of my kidneys? Go on eBay, post it, $10,000. Some person wants to buy it. I'm a consenting adult. They're a consulting. Where I'm getting at with this, prostitution or any of these issues that seem to, at least particularly to conservatives, like that doesn't feel right in terms of values. Like Haidt would put that in the purity, value that you don't sell your body, you don't sell your organs. There's certain things you just like, if I went over to a friend's house for dinner and offered to pay, or if I went to a restaurant and said, look, I don't have any money, but I'll have you over next weekend. It'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Right. These are conflicting values. What is from an economist position? Organ donations and things like that.
I wrote about that long ago. There are compelling reasons to make legal the selling of kidneys. You can live quite well with only one kidney. My neighbor, 2 doors down, donated one of his kidneys to the mother of one of his daughter's friends a couple of years ago. It was a couple of days in the hospital. He was back at work within 3 or 4 days, and he never talks about it. I don't think most people who know him have any idea that he did that. And his life expectancy, unless he has an accident that damages the one remaining kidney and wouldn't have damaged the other one, is exactly the same as it would have been had he not done that. So the consequences to the donor are nobody would want to go through that surgery for fun. It's not, there's risk. Of course, it's a big step, but the gain to the recipient of the kidney is huge compared to the cost to the donor. And so in the usual efficiency calculus, we would say that's a thing that ought to happen. But
Right.
but the idea that you would sell the kidney and that would be your motive for doing it. He got no money, of course, doing this. I inquired, why would we say it's okay to do that, but you can't do it for money? There are many things that we don't want people to do for money that we say are fine to do if you do them voluntarily. And it's a sense that you wouldn't want your kids, if they were poor and struggling. The metaphor I often use for what it means to be on the economic margin is you're really working every angle you can to get your kid into a school of reasonable
Right.
quality. When in 2000, in the early 2000s, we liberalized borrowing terms. When I bought a house, maybe when you did too, the first time, you had to have a third down or
Yeah.
whatever. You could buy a house with no money down, balloon payments, all this. It was much, much easier to bid more than you used to be able to for a house. And so, of course, some people were going to take advantage of that. And if you didn't, you would be essentially consigning your kids to the crummy schools. The good schools are always in.
You're a sucker if you don't take advantage of this.
Yeah, the good schools are just in the more expensive neighborhoods, so you got to do it if you want to keep up. And yet, when everybody does it, everybody borrows more than they can afford. Half of the kids go to bottom half schools, the same as before. That's the rub. And it would be one more thing thrown into that calculus. So we just can't get into the school district we want. Maybe if we sell a kidney, we could. So everybody's selling kidneys, and still half the kids are in bottom half schools. I'm not sure that's a sufficient argument to make it illegal, because if everyone's selling kidneys, then there's no more anybody dying of kidney disease because they couldn't get a replacement. So there'd be a huge benefit that you don't see in the case of people bidding.
Interesting.
Because they borrow more.
Yeah, another one of these related issues that I've changed my mind on, two of them, prostitution and polygamy. In my more libertarian youth, I thought, well, they should do whatever they want. They're, consenting adults, none of the government's business. But then, when you start reading about the women that are married off to these old guys that are, they're like 12, or they're raised, they know no other life other than this. Speaking of the fundamentalist Mormons in Colorado and northern Arizona and so forth, it's like, wait a minute. So the assumption is they're consenting adults making rational choices. But if you're 12, you're not making a rational choice. So in the case of prostitution, there's a lot of drug addiction, poverty. This is not like I'm doing this because I'm making money and this is a rational choice. It's more.
Would you feel better about polygamy if it were the case that only adults could be involved?
Yeah, it would depend on how they got to that decision. Like, again, if you're born into a polygamous religion and nothing else. I mean, I've watched these, those shows, the Sister Wives and all this stuff, and they seem like, well, they just love this, but I can't help but think, yeah, but you have no idea what the rest of the world's like.
Yeah, a lot of men think, boy, wouldn't it be great if they allowed you to have 2 or 3 wives?
Well, not me. I don't think like that at all.
I don't have that view. You don't have it either. But there are many men who, oh, well, that'd be. But what they don't stop to reckon with is that if it were allowed, some men would have 3 wives or more, but that would mean that there would be other men with no wives.
Right.
So remember Big Love, the HBO?
Yes.
So Bill Hendrickson has 3 wives.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. They're all beautiful. But if the top 10% of men have 3 wives, that means the rest of the pool is very unbalanced.
Right.
You've got 90 men competing for 70 women. And if you think courtship is expensive now, imagine what it would be like if there were 90 men chasing 70 women. It would be just, you'd have to buy 4 dozen roses. You have to give up 6 months' salary, not 2 months for an engagement diamond.
Yeah. I don't know how sustainable a system like that would be if that actually happened. I guess China is going to go through this in the next half century or so.
Well, most legislatures around the world, which are populated mostly by male legislators, vote against polygamy.
Yeah.
And if
because it's not sustainable.
Well, it's maybe because life would be tough for most men if it were legal. I mean, life is tough for most men in polygynous animal
Yes,
species,
yes.
most males, and it's not any reason to think it'd be different
Yeah.
humans.
Napoleon Chagnon wrote about that in his Yanomamo
Uh,
monograph. About the most successful warriors had several wives. Well, that means there's a bunch down at
Yeah.
the bottom, and they're not going to just take it. They're going to fight for.
Well, they'll
something.
take all sorts of risks to move
Right.
up in the queue,
Right.
and then you see some really
Some violence
stuff.
goes up. Yeah, yeah, those are hard issues. So, no, I mean it's just constant debate about again those conflicts between utilitarian decisions and rights.
But it's good to have those conversations.
Yes, yeah,
It teases out, what's the right theory to bring to bear to think about.
Another thing I wanted to get your thing I've been thinking about for pretty much my whole adult life is, and now especially since I'm married to a German woman, how do you get the most cultured, educated, intelligent people in Western civilization to become Nazis in a matter of a few years? And recent, I just had Hugo Mercier, my podcast last week. We haven't posted this yet, but his book is called Not Born Yesterday. And his argument, he cites some new research I hadn't seen. He thinks that most Germans did not support the Nazi ideology. That, in fact, you have two effects: pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes it, so I better go along with it.
Right.
And then the KL system, the concentration camp system, where people are punished for dissenting.
Right.
So if you have a spiral of silence and then punishment for anyone who says anything in
Right.
response, so other people go, oh, wait a minute, he's with me, okay, and maybe we can get enough of this. And that caused it to sort of hover in midair for 12 years. And then when the whole thing collapses, everybody's like, well, I never.
Yeah. No, that's one of the most powerful and vivid illustrations of behavioral contagion that I think we're ever going to find is ordinary people who are probably just as likely to be decent in everyday life as anyone we would meet here. Those people, like we are, apparently too, we have within us the capacity to follow others down a path one step at a time that leads to horrible places. Yeah, I went to school in the South. I grew up in South Florida, which isn't really the South, but I knew some wonderful individuals who had just racially abhorrent views, and I knew them well enough and liked many of them well enough to actually be able to apprehend that if I'd grown up in the environments they'd grown up in, I had no confidence I would have any different views.
Right.
And so yeah, it's good to be humble about how immune you are to those kinds of social forces, and because they're so powerful, that's why I think we really need to just think creatively about how to harness them in the best possible way to avoid the harm they can cause and bring out the gains that they could summon in us.
Yeah, I just posted some of those pictures from the Sobibor camp that were just released. They were discovered by the grandson of one of the guards, one of the lead head guards at Sobibor. That found his grandfather's photo album. And most of the pictures are of these guys just drinking, hanging out, partying with their wives, and it's and they're like 10 feet from the fence where the gas chamber is. It's and there's another album like the Auschwitz album that's something like that from the families, and Rudolf Hirst, the commandant for a while. He had a house and his whole I think 4 or 5 girls, and they were just one equivalent of 1 block away from the crematoria. And leading relatively normal lives, except for this one thing. So yeah, what would we be? So if we could be chronically frozen, if you could be chronically frozen, brought back 500 years from now, looking back, you wonder, well, what is it these people in the early 21st century believe that is just absurd? Like no one today, 500 years from now, would believe
that. Oh, good.
If you knew that, we wouldn't believe it. But
yeah, good question. I've my mother was a very religious person in an odd way. She was late in her life a member of an Indonesian meditation society, but took such deep value in her experience, and I think she always worried about me that I was not religious and have not been from very early on, and it wasn't that I think people like Dawkins are are very hostile to religion because it does harm, which it does obviously do. But I think the critics are not sufficiently cognizant of the things people take from their religious experience. Every society has had it. All the primitive ones have some kind of narrative that they embrace. So it's got to be in some vague way deeply adaptive to go down that path. And I feel like I could not go down that path. If somebody.
Now, do you mean the belief in God path or religion? Because those are kind of two separate things.
Well, in my case, both.
Both,
But
yeah.
it's easy for me to imagine a world where nobody believes in God anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, we're closer to a world like that now than we were when I was young.
Totally. We're up to 33% 25% of all Americans, 33% of millennials, and probably about 40% of iGeners. But they're no religious affiliation, not necessarily atheists.
Well, I think all my sons are atheists. I'm pretty sure.
You're pretty sure you're not sure?
I'm pretty sure they are. And one of my sons, I think, would like to hold high office someday. And he knows that in today's climate, that would not be a real possibility for him. He wouldn't be willing to pretend to be religious, as many people obviously have done all along, in order to hold high office. But I think he believes that the day might come when the percentage numbers you cited are high enough that it might actually be at least a realistic possibility.
Yeah, Dawkins and my other atheist liberal friends were certain Obama was really secretly an atheist. I don't know. He goes to church. He says he believes. Got to take him at his word.
And I think, have you ever talked to Deirdre McCloskey?
Yes, I know Deirdre.
Deirdre is religious.
I know.
I would not have expected that.
She works on me whenever I see her at conferences.
The first conversation I had with Deirdre after she became Deirdre, not Don, she'd been taking hormone treatments for a long time. I asked her, did becoming female make her into less of a hard ass? Don McCloskey was always a notorious hard ass.
Yeah.
And she said she wasn't sure yet. I think from my own just casual observation that it did in a way, but
softer.
She was still a pretty hard ass.
Yeah.
Outlook on
that could
things.
be age too. People mellow sometimes.
Yeah.
She just wrote a really heart-wrenching essay. I don't know if you read it, about her children not speaking to her.
I heard her give an hour interview about that.
Yeah.
I felt such hostility to those kids.
Yes. Yeah.
What?
See, this is the kind of thing maybe maybe even 50 years from now, or even 25 years from now, looking back on the way people treat gays and lesbians and so on, that'll just be, like the same-sex marriage. You document how quickly that happened compared to, say, interracial marriage. That took much longer. I mean, my students are shocked when I said it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry all the way up to 1967.
The Loving case,
The Loving case. It's like, that took a long time to shift. And even civil rights and women's rights movement took a long time. The gay rights thing happened faster, way faster.
You have to remember, in 2008, it was the lead up to the California referendum. There was an individual state referendum about whether to permit same-sex marriage. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both came out publicly against the pro position in that referendum.
Although I often wonder when you see that, are they saying that because they have to say it to get elected?
Oh, of course, of course.
But maybe inside they're thinking, well,
of course, that was a purely
right.
They felt it was politically necessary.
Oh, but your point is that now it's okay to say it,
and it's
say what you really believe.
Totally safe to say that they're in favor of it now.
Right,
but they thought it wasn't safe to say that just 6 years before the Supreme Court decision.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Yeah. So, the animal rights people who I interviewed for Moral Arkham, that chapter, they're certain that, back to what will we think of as crazy 100 years from now, eating animals.
Yeah. No, I totally. I wish I'd had the wit to think of that example when you asked me one.
They even call it it's the Auschwitz of today. You know, this kind of thing. It's like, whoa. Well, they're referring to factory farms.
Yes.
They are pretty gruesome.
They're grim. Yeah. Once you see them, if you continue to patronize
it's just,
any meat source from those.
See, there we need when you're behavioral contagions. It's just you go to a friend's house for dinner, restaurants. It's just so easy. It's just the meat is there and it's good.
Right.
And you got to eat because you're hungry.
Right.
That's an additional thing. I don't have to have slaves, but I got to eat.
Right.
Something like that. That's a little bit harder. I mean, when you look at the tracking of number of vegans and vegetarians, it's still in the single digits, barely creeping up. I don't know what's going to tip that.
I think I heard Cory Booker interviewed before he dropped out of the presidential campaign, and it was Ezra Klein interviewing him, who is a vegan himself. Booker himself, too, is a vegan. Why don't you recommend that everybody be a vegan? Klein asked Booker, and he said, if I did that, maybe 0.5% of the public would become vegan on my urging. If I suggest to people that they think about possibly eating meat a few times less frequently during the month, I would produce a reduction in total meat consumption many-fold what I would get if I did the other. And that's the first step. And the first step, this is the second of the two reasons that I mentioned earlier about why I think voluntary action has way more impact than I once thought it did. And the first is because people copy you. The second one is that when you do those small things, it subtly changes who you are. We become who we are. We're not born into the world.
Aristotle's habits, virtue ethics.
Yeah. We are what we repeatedly do. Was the way Durant summarized Aristotle on that point. And when you buy a hybrid, when you don't buy plastic straws, when you eat meat less often, you take your bike instead of drive. If you do those things, that changes who you are. It makes you, if you were concerned about the climate in the first place, it makes you more of a climate advocate. And when it transforms you, it makes you much more likely to vote for the politicians who will adopt the policies that I always used to say, without which we can't make any progress. Issue. You'll contribute to their campaigns. I've been doing way more of that than I ever have done in the past. And you'll get out and knock on doors for people to help get them elected. So I think the individual actions, it's kind of like having a lottery ticket. It's a small effect. It might not, probably won't pan out in anything dramatic, but it could.
Well, see, this is one of those areas where I recognize that language matters. So like in racial attitudes toward people or gays, using the N-word or calling someone a faggot, we just don't do that anymore.
Right.
And that's good.
Yep.
I think this is good.
Yep.
It didn't have to be pass a law. Just, all of us just raise our consciousness. So, but now the personal pronoun thing, it's sometimes I feel like this is going so far, but I recognize the arguments like, okay, yeah, I get that.
Yeah,
use,
my kids have helped me with that one. I had intense grammar training as a young person, and it was always very important that the number of the pronoun agree with the referent. And if those didn't agree, it was just like fingernails on a blackboard. But for people who are non-binary, this is a very big ticket issue, and not to honor their views on this is just unkind to a degree that, I try to avoid having to make those decisions when I write. But if I find myself when I've got to actually, do I honor this or not? I honor it.
I think it's becoming acceptable grammatically now to use they to describe one person, so you don't have to say he, she, he, and that's kind of clumsy too.
I still try to figure out a way to make the sentence plural if I can. People when they don't do this or that.
Right.
Sometimes you can glide it, but not always.
Yeah. Well, Robert, we've been going a long time. Just fascinating conversation. What's the next project or book or?
I've never known what the next one would be.
Really? You don't plot it out?
I don't. No. All the things I've worked on are things I've kind of stumbled upon that puzzled me. And that's a luxury to be able to do that. It would not be good advice for a junior academic, probably But for me, I think if I'd followed any other strategy, I wouldn't have amounted to anything at all. So at least I got some work done doing this.
Well, maybe you'll be the campaign manager for your son's presidential run.
That would
You can organize the equivalent of the Yang Gang for your son.
that would be a thrill for me. I have some of the books have come from columns that have generated loud responses from
right.
readers, and one that I've been thinking about making into a book was one I wrote about synthetic diamonds or manufactured diamonds.
Right.
They're now completely indistinguishable from mined diamonds, except by a process that no expensive institution even could afford to test them with, and they're So there's no way anybody would say I'm not as pleased with the look of my diamond.
Right.
So I think ultimately it won't be possible for mined diamonds to continue to sell at a premium over the cost of whatever it is to produce one of these manufactured ones. But then that's going to be true of a lot of different things that are right now very expensive. And so I thought it would be fun to write a book about speculating about where value would eventually reside going forward.
Before I let you go, UBI, speaking of Yang, universal basic income, what is an economist's position on that?
There's a whole lot to commend it. I like even better than it's maybe a combination UBI plus another layer. Give people a UBI way too small for not only a couple with kids to live on, but way too small for 10 or 20 couples to pool and live on. That's the risk.
I haven't heard that one.
The UBI that would support a family of four in an urban area, it'd have to be $30,000 or $40,000. I think Yang would probably say, all right, well, $12,000 a person.
Right.
That's $48,000.
Yeah.
If you had 10 families with that stipend, you're talking about $480,000.
Right.
You buy a very nice piece of property in Idaho. You set up your compound. You keep some goats, some chickens, some vegetable gardens.
Interesting.
You make a pond and set up your volleyball net. And maybe only a handful of people would do that, but Fox would find them first. Probably there'd be footage on the nightly news of them frolicking, reading Marx and swimming naked.
They're not working.
Swimming naked in the pond, practicing their guitars. Fine, we can tolerate that. We're a rich country.
Yeah.
But I think political support for the program would quickly evaporate if people saw that.
Would you have to... it would displace current welfare and unemployment insurance.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't displace health coverage because that's right.
That's separate. Yeah.
So what I propose in lieu of that is a much, much smaller UBI, one that wouldn't let a group to form and frolic at taxpayer expense. So you wouldn't have those politically destructive images circulating. And you want more? That we have a useful task that the public would benefit from you doing. Plant seedlings on a roading hillside. Help drive old people where they need to get to. Help staff a daycare center.
But what about people like let's say you took away unemployment insurance and welfare and food stamps and that sort of thing, and we have a huge homeless problem now in L.A. Most of them are, mentally ill, drug addicted, alcohol. They're just down and out. So they get $1,000. It's gone in 3 days, and then they're like, "You got to help me. I'm out."
Yeah.
Then what do we do?
Well, I think probably leaving the severely mentally ill to fend for themselves was not the right thing to have done in the first place.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's a separate problem to solve.
All right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens if Yang gets. We're doing this on the eve of the first caucuses, so it'll be interesting to see how far that goes. Again, it's so hard to predict who's going to rise and who's not.
It's fluid. Yeah, nobody knows. That's the interesting thing about it.
Well, Robert, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the new book.
And Michael, thanks to you.